Iraq is a country that reaches from the Persian Gulf along the fertile plains of the Tigris and Euphrates River to the borders of the Anatolian Plateau. The first signs of human life date back to the 6th millennium before Christ. Since then, the region has accumulated an incredibly rich history, a diverse population, and a vast culture, until it became the country we know today. Modern Iraq dates back to 1920, when the British Mandate for Mesopotamia was created. A British-backed kingdom was established in 1921 under Faisal I of Iraq. The kingdom gained independence from the UK in 1932, but would only survive until 1958, when the monarchy was overthrown and the Republic of Iraq was created. Iraq encompasses a significant amount of minorities. The Iraqi north would be ruled by the Kurds in their own autonomy zone, while the rest of the country is populated by Arabs. The predominant religion is Islam, with a mix of Sunni in the center and to the west, and Shia Muslims to the southeast. The diversity would, unfortunately, lay the foundation for sectarian and ethnic violence. In the young republic, different interests would collide, until the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party would emerge victorious in the strife. One of its sinister members would carry the sole responsibility of leading the country into a decade-long downward spiral. Saddam Hussein would rise through the party ranks and slowly but surely rule Iraq with an iron fist. Apparently, he saw himself as the successor of King Nebuchadnezzar II and loved to be called Al-Qaid ad-Darudi, the irreplaceable leader or the Führer. He would also constantly suppress minorities and political opponents. With his invincibility complex and delusion, he would doom his country. On the first light of the 22nd of September 1980, the Iraqi Air Force bombed airfields and military targets in neighboring Iran. Merely hours later, 200,000 men in 6 divisions crossed the border in the belief that a swift victory would be on their way. Little did they know that it was just the beginning of an 8-year-long conflict that would see hundreds and thousands of casualties. When Iraq gained its independence from Britain, long-standing territorial disputes reignited again with Iran. The Shatt al-Arab waterway plays a vital role in maritime shipping for both nations. Conflicting territorial claims and disputes over navigation rights were among the main factors for the start of the Iran-Iraq War. In 1969, Iran abrogated the treaty over the river and stopped paying tolls for the use of the waterway, a direct response to Iraq's territorial claims over the river. Since neither side was willing to back down but not yet committed to a full-scale conflict, proxy wars in the opposing territories were fought. Iran financed the Kurdish rebellion in the Northern Territory. Iraq, on the other side, supported the separatism in Kazakhstan. From April 1974, the situation would continuously escalate. Both parties would exchange artillery fire along the disputed river. The 1975 Algiers Accords cemented Iran in its leading position, but only in exchange for a downfall of their Kurdish allies. The Algiers Accords was viewed as national humiliation in Iraq, but caused much bitterness over what was seen as Iranian bullying. The humiliation would not go unanswered, and soon Iraq would seek another chance for retaliation. The 1979 revolution in Iran overthrew not only the royal dynasty, but also shifted the paradigms in the world. The newly Islamic Republic and its supreme leader Ayatollah Khomeini was strictly anti-American. Almost immediately, the theocratic government began to purge the military and to suppress the opposition. Over 12,000 army officers were forced into early retirement. Specialists and aviators were executed, expelled or imprisoned. The desertion rate had reached 60% and left the once mighty Iranian army in a weakened state, but it would never recover from. But in their eyes this was just the beginning. The supporters called for an all-out revolution in the whole Islamic world and inspired a dangerous amount of radicals. Islamist insurgents rose up in Saudi Arabia in 1979, in Syria in 1982, and Lebanon in 1983. As Iran was in chaos, Saddam mobilized his army and was about to take advantage of a weakened enemy, or so he thought, because nothing rallies more people to a common cause than an enemy. On September the 22nd, a full-scale ground invasion occurred along the common border. The aim was to take control of the waterway along the oil-rich Kazakhstan province and to rally all enemies of the regime. The war can be separated into 3 main theaters. On the northern front, the Iraqis built strong defense positions to protect the oil industry in the Kurdish autonomy zone. The prediction was that Iran would eventually reconnect with its Kurdish allies and seize the northern oil fields, which would be correct. On the Central Front, the army advanced until Desful in order to block a counter-offensive and cover the advance of the forces into the south. In 1981, during Operation Nasr, it would be the place where over 350 tanks from both sides would hunt each other down in the greatest tank battle of the war. In the end, Iranian misplanning resulted in a decisive defeat. For more than a year, the Central Front withstood any offensive. The bulk of the army advanced into the south, with the goal of occupying the Khuzestan province and laying siege to Khorramshahr and Abadan. Even though the Iranians were outnumbered, they made up for it with heavy fortifications, trenches and kill zones, which took the Iraqis days to overcome. After a week, they finally stood at the city gates. 5 weeks of intense urban combat eventually made the Iranians retreat towards friendly lines, and Iraq gained a tactical victory, but only on paper. Despite being outnumbered, the garrison took the momentum out of the offensive and overthrew the Iraqi invasion plans, but also gave the Iranians enough time to prepare Abadan. The fighting was so fierce that the city would be given the nickname Kunin Shah, or the City of Blood. It was a small-scale Stalingrad, on which both sides lost about 7,000 men, and the city was down to just a few buildings. However, another Stalingrad just laid a few clicks down the river, Abadan and its precious oil refinery. Abadan was never fully encircled and could be supplied by air, sea and land. For almost 10 months, the Iraqis forced their way into the city at the cost of another 4,000 men and hundreds of armored vehicles. The attrition was so devastating that the first Iranian counteroffensive on the 27th of September 1981 expelled the Iraqis indefinitely. 1 year later, Iran launched Operation Bait al-Muqaddas, which aimed at the liberation of Khuzestan. About 65,000 Iranians sent the Iraqi army straight back home. About 40,000 Iraqis were either killed or captured, together with about 700 tanks and APCs. But Iran had to pay a high price for the victory. For the liberation of its territory, about 60,000 men were sacrificed. And when I say sacrificed, I really mean in that way. Human wave assaults would be a new common occurrence in the war. Countless child soldiers were sent ahead to clear minefields. Casualty rates of up to 90% per battalion would be no rarity. The liberation sent a shockwave through Iraq. The army was demobilized and several generals were executed. Iraq's navy was destroyed. The air force lost air superiority and the army has been depleted. The country would lack the power to go on any major offensive for years. Furthermore, Iraq was now in the defense. For the first time in 2 years, a ceasefire was on the table, but destiny had different plans for both nations. Iran would not step down until Iraq was an Islamist republic. Iraq prepared an advanced trench system along the common border that grinded down human waves. Saddam would also receive new international credits, arms deliveries and intel. Also for the first time in this war, chemical weapons would see the battlefield. Iran on the other side had to cannibalize its American and British made hardware for spare parts, since the US sanctions made it quite difficult, but not impossible, to import new equipment. Morale, however, was still high among the population. Operation Ramadan was the first Iranian offensive into enemy territory. Its main objective was to capture the city of Basra. About 150,000 Iranians and 100,000 Iraqis would take part in the largest land battle since World War II. 3 weeks and 20,000 casualties later, and Iran was now the owner of 50 square kilometers of sand. This was just the beginning of a long list of disastrous campaigns. At least in the north, disputed territory could be reclaimed and some territorial gains could be made throughout 1982. In 1983, Iranian offensives in the central sector could claim only minimal gains, and the war largely came to a stalemate in that year. In 1984, however, Iran opened a new front in the north of Iraq. Together with the Kurdish insurgents, Iran staged a guerrilla campaign that threatened the oil fields close to Kirkuk. In the center, Operation Khyber was the attempt to cut off the highway from Basra to Baghdad by an assault through the marshlands. Even though the marshes absorbed explosions, the Iranians were sitting ducks for helicopters and mustard gas. Another 40,000 casualties later, and Iran was the proud owner of Majun Island, an economic hub that holds Iraq's Gulf pipelines. 1982 saw the beginning of the tanker wars and wars of the cities. In order to cripple each other's economy, which was heavily reliant on oil and LNG exports, tankers were hunted down, either with aircraft or patrol boats. The offensives did little damage to the Gulf states, and Iran simply moved its shipping port, while Iraq received help from Kuwait and the US. The War of the Cities was a strategic bombing campaign launched by Iraq, with limited retaliation efforts by Iran. At first it would be a costly war or air superiority, but later a literal Scud missile duel would cause fear among the population. 1985 saw action once again around the Majun oil field and the Baghdad-Basra highway, which was finally captured by Iran. Iraq's counterstrike, however, consisted of flooding Iranian trenches and the use of chemical weapons, which forced the Iranians to surrender their positions with barely any resistance. On the night of the 10th of February 1986, the Iranians launched Operation Dawn 8 with the goal of capturing the Al-Faw Peninsula. 30,000 men crossed the Shatt al-Arab River and overwhelmed the garrison, something that the Iraqis believed would never happen. After just 24 hours, the operation was completed, since badly trained conscripts were abandoning their positions. Counteroffensives were bogged down, and Iran remained the ruler of the peninsula for now. Saddam's response was to take the border city of Mehran and to advance deep into Iranian territory, which was successful at first, until the spearhead ran into an ambush. The counterstrike was so powerful that the Iraqi army lost 9,000 men, 200 tanks and APCs, while Iran got away with just 700 KIAs on their side. The last 2 years saw repeated Iranian offensives on all fronts, with the same results: little gains or massive losses. Slowly but surely, Iran ran out of steam. During another assault on Basra, Iran deployed 200,000 men, of which 60,000 would not return. In the 8th year of the conflict, the Iranian morale crumbled, recruitment dropped, and the equipment losses cancelled any new offensive. The final blow for Iran was a new offensive in Al-Faw, in which a renewed and highly trained Iraqi army fought the worn-down militias, with barely any casualties. In just 2 days, the peninsula changed the owner. Iraq had a steady supply of new equipment, more chemical weapons, and improved training capabilities. The US also involved itself when an Iranian mine damaged an American ship. Countless oil platforms and cruisers were set ablaze as a retaliation. Faced with the odds of fighting the Americans, a crippled economy, low morale, a new full-scale invasion, and even more chemical weapons, the Iranians finally gave in and accepted UN Resolution 598, as well as the status quo from 1975. The fighting eventually ceased and peace was about to return to the Arabic world, but not before Saddam settled an outstanding problem. The Anfal campaign was aimed at driving out Kurdish resistance in the province, but ended in a genocide. Anywhere between 50,000 to 100,000 people were killed by gas or shot. The survivors fled or were incarcerated in detention camps without permissions to return to their homes after the war. Even today, this event barely gained any international attention. The 8-year-long conflict had seen somewhere up to 1 million killed and wounded for both sides. Iraq just had a population of 14 million people, while Iran had 40 million people in the 80s. At one point, every Iraqi male was one way or another involved in the war. The economic loss was believed to exceed 500 billion for each country. In addition, economic development stalled and oil exports were disrupted. Just for comparison, the total oil revenue for both countries have amounted to 420 billion in the past 50 years. Iran's new theocratic government prevails despite the international isolation. The regime is still entangled in worldwide state-sponsored terrorism and also finds itself in a proxy war with Saudi Arabia that ranges from Africa to all over the Middle East. After the war, Iraq's main task was to repay the debt. The country financed its war effort with credits, but was barely able to repay the difference. While the creditors strongly opposed violent Islamic revolutions, they were not so keen on debt forgiveness. On top of that, Kuwait and the UAE were exceeding the OPEC quotas, which led to an overall price decrease that killed the Iraqi budget. Instead of $18 per barrel, $10 was the overall price, a deficit of $7 billion per year for Iraq. Revenues struggled to cover the basic costs, let alone repair damaged infrastructure. Massive demobilization and unemployment on top caused a climate of dissatisfaction, which is not optimal for a dictator, especially if you want to remain one. Iraq fell out of favor with a lot of Gulf states internationally. The loss of reputation and the crippling debt pushed the dictator over the edge. Since no one was willing to support Iraqi rebuilding efforts, Saddam took matters in his own hands and caused a domino effect when he decided to cross the border into Kuwait on the 2nd of August 1990 and initiate the Gulf War. It was a quiet night on the 2nd of August 1990 at the Desert Palace in Kuwait City, the residence of the Emir, when suddenly multiple helicopters broke the silence and landed commando units in the area. Immediately, a fierce firefight started with the palace guard. This was the first operation to seize control over a small Gulf state. Simultaneously, 88,000 Iraqis faced 20,000 Kuwaiti soldiers. Despite months-long saber rattling, Kuwait did not have its forces on alert and was caught off guard. 100 hours after the commandos landed, Kuwait was overrun. Iraq just lost 300 men, while Kuwait suffered 420 KIA. Those who were not captured fled to Saudi Arabia. Just a few days later, Saddam Hussein announced that Kuwait would become the 19th province of Iraq. Baghdad claimed that the neighboring Kuwait was stealing oil through slant drilling. Kuwait also produced more petroleum than granted, which destroyed the market price and ultimately Iraq's revenue. After 8 years of war with Iran, Iraq was bankrupt. During the war, the small nation incurred more than $130 billion in debt. The international community condemned the invasion and brought economic sanctions against Iraq into play. Following the conquest of Kuwait, Saddam was also within striking distance to the Saudi oil fields, the greatest oil reserves in the world. Whoever controls those oil fields would also have a majority of the world at his mercy. It was never really clear if Saddam intended to strike. If so, Iraq would have turned into the world's most powerful oil supplier. Everyone would have to get in line just to get their hands on the black gold. Just the prospect alone was something that was unacceptable for a lot of countries. A coalition of 35 nations under US guidance eventually reached a strength of 1 million men. On the 29th of November 1990, the UN Security Council demanded a withdrawal from Kuwaiti territory until the 15th January 1991. The deadline passed, but no demands were met. On the following day, the Cold War turned hot. The dawn of victory nears as this great showdown begins. An extensive aerial bombing campaign was carried out for 42 consecutive days and nights. 88,500 tons of bombs were dropped in one of the largest and most intense military bombing campaigns in history. Iraq on the other side countered with a Scud missile campaign against the coalition. 47 missiles were shot into Saudi Arabia. Qatar and Bahrain would each receive one. Despite not being aligned in the conflict, Israel would register 42 hits. Israel was specifically targeted to draw the Jewish state into the war. Retaliation could cause the Arab coalition members to drop out or switch sides. Due to their mobility, ballistic missiles remain hard to track and take down. It was feared that the warheads could be equipped with chemical or nuclear material and could cause significant damage. Fortunately, none of those scenarios ever materialized. On the 29th of January 1991, the first major ground engagement took place when 3 Iraqi armored and mechanized divisions assaulted the Saudi Arabian city of Khafji. The initial response consisted of heavy airstrikes followed by a coalition ground assault that encircled the city. Resistance was futile and most Iraqis surrendered. In just 3 days, the Iraqi incursion was finished. We had sustained more punishment from Allied air power in 30 minutes at Khafji than in 8 years of fighting against Iran. On the 15th February, the 7th US Army Corps and the 1st British Armored Division would spearhead into Iraq, covered by the 82nd Airborne and the 6th French Light Division on their left. On their right side, a joint task force of Egyptian, Saudi, Kuwaiti and US Marines would move into Kuwait. After a series of small engagements, the 7th Army Corps would engage in the largest tank battle of the war. On their way to Objective Norfolk, they would be met by entrenched armored Iraqi forces. During the offensive, the coalition forces would obliterate the Iraqi counterparts. By the end of the operation on the 28th of February, more than 3,000 tanks, 2,000 APCs, 2,200 artillery pieces, 110 aircraft and 19 ships would have been destroyed, while the coalition would suffer minimal losses. The Iraqi army barely existed anymore. During the retreat, the Iraqi forces set fire to over 700 of Kuwait's oil wells and effectively destroyed their economy. The retreating convoy along the Highway 80 from Kuwait to Basra, Iraq was brought to halt by mines. All available units were ordered to strike, which started a 10-hour turkey shoot. By the end of the massacre, more than 2,700 vehicles were destroyed and thousands killed. Not only military personnel, but civilians as well. The road was later nicknamed Highway of Death, and its incidents would be aired on TV stations all around the world. The images would force George H. Bush to halt all military actions and to return to the negotiation table. Throughout the 7 weeks, the coalition suffered 292 casualties and 1,200 wounded. Minor vehicle and equipment losses were recorded. Iraq fielded 650,000 men and lost up to 50,000 in combat. 75,000 were wounded, 80,000 captures, 3,300 tanks destroyed, 2,100 APCs and 2,200 artillery pieces were lost. Iraq had to pay billions in war reparations, while the UN enforced import and export bans onto the countries for years to come. Saddam would lose his reputation and favor with his former allies and never recover from that. The sudden weakness was exploited by the Kurdish and the Shia population that revolted against the Ba'athist Sunni leadership. Despite the one month-long uprising, it displaced nearly 2 million people and killed at least 30,000 men, and ended in a crushing defeat for the rebels. Iraq has been defeated, Saddam has been humiliated, and the score has been settled. Peace would be the logical consequence, right? No, unfortunately not. It was just a break, a prelude to the terror of the Iraq War and the rise of Daesh.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
On the morning of the 20th March 2003, a coalition force of 200,000 men from 4 countries crossed the border into southern Iraq. They would face an estimated army of over 600,000 poorly equipped Iraqi soldiers. In the three-pronged assault, the coalition forces steamrolled over every bit of resistance. On April 2nd, in just 12 days, they reached the outskirts of Baghdad and captured the city in a bloody urban combat a week later. With the fall of Tikrit, the hometown of Saddam Hussein, the country was under the control of the coalition forces on April 15th. Up to this point, the coalition forces suffered 240 losses and over 1,000 wounded. Estimates on Iraqi losses sum up to 45,000 combatants. The civilian body count was estimated to be 7,300. Parallel to the events in the south, 70,000 Kurdish Peshmerga in northern Iraq were taking up arms with US Special Forces and thousands of paratroopers to open a second front against Iraqi forces and to eliminate an Islamic terrorist cell. The militant Islamists controlled a small sector of northern Iraq in an area outside of Saddam Hussein's control. At the time of the invasion, they fielded about 600 to 800 fighters, but were driven out of Iraq during Operation Viking Hammer. A notable member of the militant group was the infamous Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the man who would play a significant role during the upcoming Iraqi insurgency. Following the defeat in the 1991 Gulf War, Iraq was devastated. Economic sanctions weakened the recovery, and minorities rebelled against the leaders in Baghdad. Despite the circumstances, the country remained in a somewhat stable situation. This would change, however, after 9/11 and the announcement of the war on terror by George W. Bush.
Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them.
The rationale was that Saddam was a supporter of terrorism and Al-Qaeda. He also planned to acquire weapons of massive destruction. When none of those accusations stuck with the UN Security Council, the US just shifted the rationale to human rights and promoting democracy. While the truth is that a memo written by Donald Rumsfeld as early as 2001 already considered a war against Iraq. It was already decided, regardless of the protest. The government and its institutions were practically non-existent anymore. Security forces have been defeated, but the coalition refused or was unable to fill the power vacuum. The results were massive looting. The Iraq Museum lost over 15,000 valuable items. Stores were plundered for food and goods, but the most serious case was the plundering of weapons and ammo caches. On top of that, some super smart human being came up with a brilliant idea that they should disband the complete military. All intel services, paramilitaries, the reserves, the Ba'athist Party and the National Olympic Committee of Iraq just 1 month later. From one day to another, at least 250,000 up to 1 million men were let go. Men that knew how to run a military organization, had military, even special forces training, and had access to firearms. Men that just lost their friends in combat and were angered by the losses and the defeat. What could possibly go wrong? A rising number of assaults towards US troops was noticed to take place in the Sunni Triangle, an area between Baghdad, Tikrit and Ramadi, and also a stronghold of a Sunni Muslim Ba'athist party under Saddam. While the first assaults were dilettantish, the insurgents began quickly to adopt more complex strategies. Better planned ambushes and the sheer number of assaults, which increased to 50 per day, would take a heavy toll on US forces. The tragic zenith was reached in October 2003, when 82 men were killed and 337 wounded during the month. While counterinsurgency showed success and even captured Saddam Hussein, Pandora's box has already been opened. While resistance would at first be only confined to Sunni regions of Iraq, Shia dissatisfaction was growing. The Mahdi army, led by the influential Muqtada al-Sadr, grew up to 10,000 men and challenged the coalition forces in the south of Iraq. On April 4, 2004, the Mahdi army coordinated an assault on multiple cities simultaneously and fought the security forces for weeks to come. Throughout 2004, the coalition forces were retaking guerrilla strongholds all over Iraq. By the end of the year, the US military reported that they captured at least 15,000 guerrillas, while 848 were killed. The number of Iraqi civilian and security forces casualties during that time is believed to be in the thousands. After al-Zarqawi barely escaped with his life, he returned to Iraq and pledged allegiance to the Al-Qaeda network. The Sunni Islamic terror organization targeted dozens of holy Shia relics and single-handedly turned the insurgency into a Sunni-Shia civil war, with the coalition forces between the front lines. The ultimate provocation happened on February 22, 2006, when Sunni rebels stormed the Al-Askari Mosque in Samarra, holy to the Shia Muslims, and partially destroyed the over 1,000-year-old building through explosives. The bombing caused unprecedented anger amongst the Shia majority, prompting Daesh squads, largely from the Mahdi army, to roam the streets of Baghdad and other major cities, attacking Sunni mosques, killing Sunni civilians, and murdering Sunni clerics in revenge. The Sunni insurgents soon organized their own resistance and death squads and began further revenge killings, causing a spiral of violence that threatened to take the country into a full-blown civil war. By June 2006, the Iraqi government reported 100 civilian casualties per day. Al-Zarqawi's karma would eventually catch up on him. His atrocities turned friends into foes, and one of them would tip American intelligence. On June 7, 2006, Zarqawi was killed in his safe house by an airstrike. As the years passed by, coalition efforts showed success. Iraq went from a failed state to a somewhat stable country, but at a high price. At the peak in 2007, 180,000 troops were stationed in Iraq, but still low-level violence was present. However, after 4 years of bloodshed and casualties, the American public began to favor a withdrawal. The US troops left Iraq on the 18th of December 2011. During the occupation, the international coalition lost 4,825 servicemen and over 32,000 were wounded. Iraqi security forces had lost 18,000 men and over 40,000 were wounded. Insurgency losses are estimated up to 38,000 and up to 120,000 were detained. Estimates on the civilian body count ranged from 100,000 to over 650,000 casualties. 2 million Iraqis fled the country. 1.7 million have been internally displaced. The total cost of the war was at minimum $1.7 trillion. The insurgency escalated again between the Sunni and the Shia militias almost immediately after the withdrawal of the coalition. The conflict merged with the Syrian civil war and would not be settled until the 9th December 2017, 14 years and 5 months after the invasion. The legality of the Iraq invasion has been challenged on numerous occasions. Several prominent supporters have publicly and privately cast doubts on its legality. Not a single instigator has been held accountable for the atrocities until this day.
The decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, too. Anyway.
Daesh is a radical Salafi organization that had its roots in the civil war between the Shia and the Sunni Muslims during the American occupation. In 2006, it would emerge from 6 radical organizations to unite with splintered Sunni resistance with the explicit goal of creating its own state. While the organization was on the verge of collapse due to mismanagement and casualties, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi would lead it back to its former strength with other capable leaders that he met while he was imprisoned in Camp Bucca. After the US withdrawal in 2011, a series of bombings destabilized Iraq and increased hostilities between the ethnic groups once again. The civil war escalated when a high-ranking Sunni politician was arrested in the Anbar province on the 13th of December 2013. This marked the start of the Anbar campaign. Tribal militias gathered and captured the cities of Fallujah, Kama and most parts of Ramadi, together with Daesh forces. As of 2014, Daesh would frequently clash with Iraqi security forces, but would emerge victorious most of the time. The support among the Sunni population was unprecedented. By mid-2014, they would be the uncontested ruler in the Anbar province. While the Iraqi security forces tried to retake the Anbar governorate, Daesh launched the northern Iraq offensive. Within just 4 weeks, they seized large parts of Iraqi and Kurdish territory. Among the captured cities were Sinjar, Kurakosh and Mosul, cities with great population of Assyrians, Yazidis and other minorities who were not treated very well. The news went viral and prompted an international military intervention. In December 2010, a series of anti-government protests destabilized the whole Arabic world. The peaceful protest eventually turned into violent revolutions and reached Syria in mid-2011. Daesh expanded by sending a Syrian-born detachment force that would establish a presence. The campaign quickly gained traction, and Raqqa would become the new capital city of the organization. During the Syria campaign, Daesh stood out as the most dominant force. However, this would change during the siege of Kobane. On the 13th September 2014, they launched a massive military operation. 10,000 fighters were ordered to take the city at the Syrian-Turkish border. 1 month later, they reached the outskirts of Kobane and besieged the city from 3 sides. Kobane was the Kurdish city. After the fall of Mosul and the atrocities that were committed, they know what was at stake. Nearly all Kurdish militant groups sent forces, together with the Free Syrian Army and US air support. Even Turkey allowed passage to Kobane for the Kurds. While both sides suffered heavy losses, eventually the coalition prevailed after 4 months. Daesh lost 2,000 men, while the coalition suffered 800 losses. Daesh was now surrounded, and it was just the time until the collapse of the proto-state. Since the beginning of 2015, they were retreating on all fronts. Tikrit was liberated in April, Sinjar in November, and Ramadi on December. Fallujah, the starting point of the insurgency, was taken in June 2016. The capital city, Raqqa, was liberated on the 3rd November 2017. The last outpost in Syria, the city of Akwani, was taken on the 23rd of March 2019. Al-Baghdadi himself hid in Barisha, a town in the north of Syria. During Operation Kayla Müller, he unalived himself with a bomb vest on October 29th, 2019. What started out as an insurgency ended in total war. During the nearly 7 years of the conflict, it is estimated that up to 100,000 fighters were fielded by the donkeys. Over 85,000 were killed. The international military alliance consisted of approximately 750,000 men. Over 100,000 paid with their lives. 50,000 civilians were killed, and more than 10 million were displaced. Since the fall of Daesh, Iraq has finally found some stability, at least compared to the last years. The country is still on the verge of another civil war, due to civil unrest, dysfunctional government and religious tensions, but is still far less violent than anything that occurred in the past. It just goes to hope that things get better. Alright guys, this is a series of videos that I planned for a very long time. I hope you enjoyed what you saw. Definitely let me know in the comments. And I'm gonna take a break for a couple of days probably, because this was a lot of work. Alright, until next time guys.